It didn't begin with a proclamation but with a silence. Behind the sealed doors of Buckingham Palace, King Charles III made a decision so unprecedented that even his most trusted advisors hesitated to record it. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, emerged from that meeting, her expression wasn't triumph, it was something far more unsettling. Because what had just been proposed would not only change her life, it would redefine the monarchy itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The meeting itself, according to what palace insiders cautiously describe, was never meant to attract attention. It was scheduled under the familiar cover of constitutional review, a routine that had become increasingly common since early 2024. Yet something about this gathering was different. Reports suggest the presence of senior constitutional advisors alongside Prince William signaled a level of urgency rarely seen in such discussions. Catherine's sudden inclusion, however, raised immediate concern. She was not expected. She was not scheduled. And in a system defined by rigid protocol, her unexpected summons marked the first crack in a carefully controlled narrative. Those familiar with palace operations began to whisper that this was no ordinary briefing, it was something far more deliberate and far more disruptive. At first, the explanation seemed harmless enough. Palace aides, maintaining their usual composure, reportedly framed the meeting as part of ongoing succession planning. After all, with the king's health under constant scrutiny, such conversations were not entirely unexpected. But the details didn't quite align. Insiders quietly pointed to unusual document preparations papers that, according to various interpretations, bore resemblance to revisions of letters patent, the very legal instruments that define royal authority. These were not documents handled lightly, nor were they adjusted without profound consequence. The mere suggestion that they were being revisited hinted at something far beyond routine planning. It hinted at transformation. What made the situation even more unsettling was Catherine herself. Known for her composure, her precision, and her ability to maintain an almost impenetrable calm under pressure, she is a true professional. She rarely allowed emotion to surface in public view. Yet those who observed her leaving that meeting described something different. Not panic, not confusion, but a controlled, almost restrained shock. It was the kind of expression that suggested understanding without acceptance, awareness without readiness. Something had been placed before her, something immense, and in that moment, she had grasped its weight. And perhaps more importantly, she had understood what it would demand of her. As the day unfolded, the atmosphere within palace walls shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Staff moved carefully, conversations became shorter, and the usual rhythm of royal operations felt slightly off. Later that evening, when William was seen in quiet conversation with Catherine, the tone was noticeably subdued. There were no outward signs of celebration, no indication of triumph. Instead, there was a quiet intensity, as if both were navigating a reality that had changed faster than they could fully process. And it was in those quiet moments that the whispers began to take shape. At first, they were dismissed. The idea itself seemed too radical, too disruptive to even consider seriously. But as more fragments surfaced, carefully worded phrases, subtle hints from those close to the inner circle, a pattern began to emerge. Insiders whisper that the concept discussed in that room was something rarely spoken of, something that had never been formally embraced within the British monarchy, a concept that challenged the very foundation of royal authority: shared sovereignty. Not symbolic partnership, not ceremonial support, but something far more profound, a restructuring of power itself. The implications of such an idea were staggering. For centuries, the crown had represented singular authority, a unified symbol embodied in one individual. To divide that authority, to share it, was to alter not just tradition, but identity. And yet, according to those closest to the situation, this was precisely what had been placed on the table. Not as a distant possibility, but as a serious consideration. A solution, perhaps, to a problem that could no longer be ignored. A response to pressures both seen and unseen, building quietly behind the facade of royal continuity. And as the whispers grew louder, one thing became clear. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not speculation spiraling out of control. Something had shifted at the very heart of the monarchy. Something deliberate. Something irreversible. because what was discussed in that room wasn't merely symbolic, it was a move that would fracture centuries of royal tradition. For over 1,000 years, the British Crown has obeyed one unbreakable rule: it belongs to one sovereign, not two, not shared, not negotiated. So when murmurs of a co-monarch began circulating through palace corridors, historians and insiders alike were left asking the same question: what crisis could justify breaking the oldest rule of the crown? The weight of that question cannot be overstated, because the monarchy has never been designed to bend in such a way. From the moment William the Conqueror claimed the throne in 1066, the structure of royal authority has remained singular, almost sacred in its simplicity. One ruler, one voice, one symbol of continuity. Even during moments of upheaval, when civil wars fractured loyalties and abdications shook the nation, the principle itself endured. It was not merely tradition, it was the spine of the institution. And through centuries of evolution, from medieval conquest to modern constitutional monarchy, that spine held firm, culminating in the steady, unchallenged reign of Queen Elizabeth II, whose authority, though softened by time, was never divided. But what makes this moment so unsettling is not just the breaking of a rule, it is the realization that such a rule could even be reconsidered. Because embedded within the monarchy's legal framework lies a rigidity that has historically resisted change. The letters patent, those carefully crafted legal instruments that define titles, powers, and succession, are not easily rewritten. They are, in many ways, the monarchy's unspoken constitution. And yet, according to reports whispered among those familiar with palace procedures, these very documents may now be under quiet review. Not for minor adjustments, not for ceremonial updates, but for something far more profound. A structural shift. A redefinition of authority itself. The idea of curule is not entirely unknown in history, but within Britain, it has always been treated as a dangerous anomaly and instability waiting to happen. Dual monarchies invite conflict, blur accountability, and weaken the clarity that the crown depends upon. That is precisely why, over centuries, the concept has been consistently rejected, dismissed not just as impractical, but as fundamentally incompatible with the British system. So for it to resurface now, not as theory but as a possible reality, suggests something deeper is at play, something urgent, something that cannot be addressed through conventional means. And that urgency, according to various interpretations, traces back to a single, unavoidable truth. Since early 2024, King Charles III has been navigating a health battle that, while managed with dignity and discretion, has undeniably altered the rhythm of royal life. Public appearances have been adjusted, responsibilities quietly redistributed. And within those adjustments, a pattern has begun to form, one that places increasing weight on the shoulders of the next generation. Not in preparation for a distant future, but in response to a present that feels increasingly uncertain. At the center of that shift stands Catherine, Princess of Wales. Her rise has not been sudden, but it has been undeniable. Over the years, she has cultivated a presence that blends relatability with quiet authority, earning public trust in a way few modern royals have managed. And in moments where stability feels fragile, that kind of influence becomes more than symbolic, it becomes essential. Insiders suggest that her growing role has not gone unnoticed within palace walls. In fact, it may have been carefully measured, observed, and ultimately considered as part of a much larger equation. Because what if this decision is not about breaking tradition for the sake of change, but about preserving it under extraordinary pressure? What if the idea of a co-monarch is being framed not as a revolution, but as a safeguard, a way to ensure continuity without the disruption of sudden transition? That, at least, is how some close to the situation have begun to describe it. Not a dismantling of the crown, but a reinforcement. Not a division of power, but a redistribution designed to hold the institution steady during a moment of vulnerability. And yet, for all its careful framing, the implications remain deeply unsettling. Because once a rule this fundamental is questioned, it cannot simply be restored to its original state. The very act of reconsideration changes everything. It opens doors that were never meant to be opened. It invites possibilities that were once unthinkable. And it forces those within the monarchy and those who watch it to confront a reality they may not be fully prepared to accept. And if history offered no precedent, then the answer had to lie in something far more immediate and far more personal. Behind the grandeur of state banquets and balcony appearances, a quieter battle has been unfolding, one that insiders say has reshaped King Charles III's thinking entirely. Because this wasn't just about legacy anymore. It was about time, and the growing realization that the crown might soon need more than one pair of steady hands to carry its weight. What makes this moment so heavy, so charged with quiet urgency, is that the shift did not happen overnight. It crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Since early 2024, reports suggest that the king has been undergoing ongoing cancer treatment, a reality carefully managed behind layers of discretion and carefully worded public updates. Official statements remained measured, calm, reassuring. But those familiar with the inner workings of the palace began to notice subtle changes that, when pieced together, told a far more complicated story. Appearances became less frequent. Engagements were quietly adjusted. The rhythm of royal duty, once steady and predictable, began to feel interrupted. And in those interruptions, something else began to take shape. Responsibilities that once rested firmly in the hands of the sovereign started to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm the public, but enough for those paying attention to recognize a pattern. According to insiders, this was not simply delegation, it was preparation. A form of what some have cautiously described as constitutional contingency planning, a phrase that sounds clinical, almost routine, but carries within it the weight of uncertainty. Because contingency planning, by its very nature, acknowledges risk. It anticipates scenarios that no institution ever truly wants to face. At the center of this evolving structure stood Prince William, stepping forward not just as heir, but as an active stabilizing force. His role, according to various interpretations, has expanded beyond expectation, moving into spaces traditionally reserved for the reigning monarch. Meetings, briefings, decisions, each one adding to a growing sense that the future was arriving faster than anticipated. Yet even as William's presence strengthened, there remained a recognition that this alone might not be enough, because the crown, in its current state, was facing a challenge not just of succession, but of continuity under pressure. And that is where Catherine, Princess of Wales, becomes impossible to ignore. Her role, once defined by support and quiet influence, has evolved into something far more central. Over time, she has built a connection with the public that feels both genuine and unshakable. Trust, once earned, becomes a powerful currency, especially in moments of uncertainty. Insiders whisper that her expanded responsibilities were not merely symbolic gestures, but calculated steps, positioning her as a pillar of stability in a time when stability could not be taken for granted. And as her presence grew, so too did the sense that she was being prepared for something far beyond traditional expectations. What is perhaps most striking is how these shifts, taken individually, seem manageable, almost ordinary within the context of a modern monarchy adapting to changing circumstances. But when viewed together, they form a much more compelling narrative. A king navigating illness, an heir stepping forward sooner than expected, a future queen rising into unprecedented prominence. And behind it all, advisors working quietly, methodically, exploring solutions that once would have been dismissed outright. Solutions that challenge the very framework of royal authority. Because if the crown is to endure, it must adapt. That much has always been true. But adaptation at this level is deeply structural. This potentially transformative comes with consequences that cannot be easily contained. It raises questions not just about the present, but about the future, about what the monarchy is willing to become in order to survive, and about how far it is willing to go to protect itself from forces it cannot fully control. And yet, even as these ideas take shape behind closed doors, even as the logic behind them begins to solidify, there remains an undeniable tension. Because not everyone sees adaptation as strength. For some, it represents risk. For others, it signals a dangerous departure from the very principles that have sustained the monarchy for centuries. And as these differing perspectives begin to surface, quietly at first, but with growing intensity, it becomes clear that the greatest challenge may not be the decision itself, but the reaction it provokes. But even in a time of uncertainty, not everyone welcomed the idea of rewriting royal tradition. The moment the proposal left that private chamber, it triggered something the palace had spent decades trying to avoid: division. Not loud, public conflict, but something colder. calculated, strategic. Because within hours, factions had begun to form, and not all of them were willing to accept Catherine, Princess of Wales's unprecedented rise. At first, the fractures were subtle, almost invisible to anyone outside the inner circle. Conversations shifted in tone. Meetings became more guarded. According to reports whispered among senior staff, long-standing alliances inside the royal household began to realign almost overnight. This was no longer a matter of routine governance, it was a question of power, of influence, of who would shape the monarchy's future at a moment when its foundation felt unexpectedly fragile. And in that uncertainty, positions hardened quickly. Senior courtiers, those tasked with protecting both the image and the structure of the crown, have been the primary guardians of the monarchy since the 16th century, found themselves divided in ways that insiders say had not been seen in decades. Some viewed the proposal as a necessary evolution, a bold but calculated response to an unprecedented situation. Others, however, reportedly questioned not just the optics, but the legality itself, because introducing the idea of shared sovereignty was not a minor adjustment, it was a fundamental shift, one that could ripple through constitutional frameworks in ways no one could fully predict. And within those debates, the tension grew sharper, more personal, more difficult to contain. At the heart of that tension, according to various interpretations, was Queen Camilla. Her position, already complex within the dynamics of the modern monarchy, was suddenly being recalibrated in ways that insiders suggest left her camp deeply uneasy. The rise of Catherine, not just as a future queen but as a potential co-holder of authority, introduced a shift in influence that could not be ignored. Sources close to palace operations whisper that concerns were raised quietly but firmly. Not in open confrontation, but through strategic conversations, carefully placed doubts, and a growing resistance to the speed at which these changes seemed to be unfolding. And yet, standing in stark contrast to that unease, was Princess Anne, whose approach, as always, remained anchored in duty rather than emotion. Known for her unwavering commitment to institutional stability, Anne is said to have viewed the situation through a different lens entirely. For her, the question was not whether the change felt comfortable, but whether it ensured the survival of the crown in a moment of vulnerability. Reports suggest that her focus remained fixed on continuity, on preserving the monarchy's function even if it required uncomfortable adjustments. And in that clarity, she became a quiet but formidable force within the unfolding debate. Caught between these competing perspectives was Prince William, positioned in what insiders describe as an increasingly delicate role. As heir, his responsibility was clear. But as both son and future king, he found himself navigating a landscape where tradition and necessity were colliding in real time. According to those familiar with the situation, William's approach has been measured, careful, almost surgical, seeking to balance respect for established norms with the undeniable need for adaptation. It is a role that demands not just leadership, but restraint, and in this moment, that restraint has become one of his most critical tools. But while these dynamics played out behind closed doors, something else was beginning to happen, something far more difficult to control. The first leaks, subtle and almost dismissible at first, began to surface. A phrase here, a suggestion there. Media insiders, always attuned to shifts within the monarchy, started to pick up on the tension. Reports framed cautiously, language carefully hedged, but the message was clear enough to spark curiosity. Something was happening inside the palace. Something unusual. And as those fragments reached the outside world, speculation began to build, feeding on uncertainty, growing stronger with each passing day. Because once the narrative escapes the walls of the palace, it takes on a life of its own. It invites interpretation, exaggeration, scrutiny. And in a situation as unprecedented as this, even the smallest detail can ignite widespread reaction. What began as a controlled internal discussion was now edging dangerously close to becoming a public story. And the palace, for all its traditions of silence and control, was facing a reality it could not fully contain. And as the palace wrestled with itself behind closed doors, the outside world was about to be pulled into the storm. When the announcement finally came, it didn't trickle out, it detonated. In a single statement, King Charles III introduced a concept that sent shockwaves through Parliament, the press, and the public alike. Catherine, Princess of Wales was no longer just the future queen. She was something else entirely, something no one had ever seen before. The wording of the statement, according to those who analyzed it line by line, was precise, almost unnervingly so. It did not declare a coronation. It did not announce an abdication. Instead, it introduced what insiders quickly began calling a co-monarch framework, a phrase that sounded carefully engineered to both reveal and conceal at the same time. Reports suggest that this language was chosen deliberately, designed to avoid immediate constitutional alarm, while still signaling a transformation that could not be ignored. But no amount of careful phrasing could soften the impact. Within minutes, the story spread beyond palace walls, igniting a wave of reaction that the monarchy had not faced in years. Across the United Kingdom, media outlets moved with urgency, each attempting to interpret what this unprecedented move truly meant. Headlines clashed, narratives diverged, and speculation surged. Some framed it as a bold evolution, a necessary step in an uncertain era. Others questioned whether the monarchy had crossed a line it could not easily return from. Constitutional experts, drawn into the unfolding drama, began raising cautious but pointed concerns. Because while the crown holds symbolic power, its structure is rooted in legal frameworks that do not bend easily. And the idea of shared sovereignty, no matter how carefully presented, raised questions that could not be answered overnight. At the heart of the reaction was a deeper tension, one that extended far beyond legal interpretation. The public itself appeared divided, not in anger, but in uncertainty. For many, Catherine's rise felt reassuring. Her presence, her composure, her ability to connect with people on a human level made the idea of expanded responsibility seem almost natural. But for others, the move introduced a quiet unease. Because if the monarchy could redefine itself in this way, what did that mean for everything else it represented? Tradition, stability, continuity, these were not just ideals, they were expectations. And now, those expectations were being tested in real time. Amid the growing noise, one detail stood out more than any official statement or expert analysis: Catherine's silence. She did not step forward to explain. She did not attempt to shape the narrative. Instead, she remained composed, measured, almost deliberately distant from the storm unfolding around her. And in that silence, the intrigue only deepened. Insiders whisper that this was no accident, that her restraint was part of a broader strategy, allowing the weight of the announcement to settle without distraction. Because sometimes, silence speaks louder than any declaration. It invites interpretation. It fuels curiosity. And in moments like this, it can become a powerful form of control. Beyond Britain, the reaction took on an even wider dimension. International headlines framed the move as a historic gamble, a moment that could redefine not just the British monarchy, but the perception of monarchy itself in the modern world. Some observers praised the decision as forward-thinking, a sign that even the oldest institutions could adapt. Others viewed it as a risk, a step into uncertain territory, where tradition might not easily guide the outcome. And as global attention intensified, the pressure on the palace grew, transforming what had begun as an internal decision into a matter of worldwide scrutiny. Because this was no longer just a royal adjustment, it was a moment of reckoning. A test of whether the monarchy could evolve without losing its essence, whether it could expand its structure without weakening its authority. And as the headlines continued to multiply, as the debates grew louder and more complex, one thing became increasingly clear. This announcement was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. But behind the spectacle of the announcement lay a far more calculated strategy, one designed not just for today, but for what comes next. What appeared to be a bold, emotional decision was, according to insiders, anything but impulsive. Because buried beneath the headlines was a carefully constructed plan, one that had been quietly taking shape for months, possibly years. And at its center was a single unspoken objective: protect the crown at all costs. Long before the public ever heard the phrase co-monarch, there were, as reports suggest, quiet discussions unfolding within the deepest layers of royal advisory circles. These were not rushed conversations or reactive decisions. They were deliberate, measured, and, according to those familiar with the process, rooted in a growing awareness that the monarchy was approaching a moment of structural vulnerability, Constitutional advisors, individuals, rarely named but deeply influential, are said to have been involved early, examining scenarios that once would have been dismissed as purely theoretical. But theory, under pressure, has a way of becoming necessity. And as the king's situation evolved, those theoretical discussions began to solidify into something far more tangible. At the center of this evolving strategy stood Prince William, not merely as heir, but as a key architect of what insiders describe as a controlled transition model. His role, according to various interpretations, extended beyond consultation into active shaping of the framework itself. This was not about stepping forward prematurely, it was about ensuring that when the moment required it, the system would already be prepared. Those close to the process suggest that William's influence helped balance two competing priorities: preserving the integrity of tradition while quietly introducing mechanisms that could support a more flexible structure. It is a delicate balance, one that demands both respect for the past and readiness for the future. And within that balance, Catherine, Princess of Wales, emerges not as an afterthought, but as a central pillar. Her positioning within this strategy appears anything but accidental. Over time, her role has expanded in ways that now seem almost predictive, as if each step had been part of a larger design. Insiders whisper that her public trust, her composure, and her ability to connect across generations made her uniquely suited to anchor a transition that could otherwise feel destabilizing. In moments of uncertainty, people look for familiarity, for reassurance, and Catherine, perhaps more than anyone else within the modern monarchy, embodies that sense of steady continuity. But strategy alone is never enough. It requires structure, and that is where the conversation turns to the legal mechanisms quietly underpinning this entire shift. Reports suggest that revisions or at least reinterpretations of letters patent may play a crucial role in enabling this new framework. These documents, historically used to define royal authority, are not easily altered. Yet they offer a pathway through which change can be formalized without dismantling the institution itself. It is a subtle approach, one that allows transformation to occur within the existing system rather than outside of it. And in a monarchy built on continuity, that distinction is everything. Timing, too, appears to have been carefully considered. According to those close to the situation, the decision to move forward now is closely tied to King Charles III's health trajectory, not as a reaction, but as a preemptive measure. The goal, it seems, is not to wait for a moment of crisis, but to act before one fully emerges. By introducing a shared structure of authority, the monarchy gains a form of resilience, a way to maintain stability even as circumstances shift. It is, in many ways, a strategy designed to avoid the very disruptions that have historically challenged royal continuity. And perhaps most revealing of all is what this plan avoids. There is no abdication, no sudden transfer of power, no dramatic break from the past. Instead, there is a gradual, almost seamless redistribution of responsibility, one that allows the crown to adapt without appearing to fracture. It is a solution that prioritizes continuity over spectacle, stability over shock, and yet, for all its careful construction, it carries within it an undeniable risk. Because even the most meticulously designed strategy cannot account for one unpredictable force, the reaction of those who witness it. Public perception, shaped by emotion as much as logic, has undone monarchs long before this moment. And as this plan begins to unfold beyond the controlled environment of palace walls, it enters a space where interpretation, doubt, and scrutiny cannot be managed in the same way. Yet even the most carefully crafted strategy cannot escape the one force that has undone monarchs for centuries: public perception. Across Britain, the reaction was immediate and deeply divided. For some, Catherine, Princess of Wales's rise symbolized strength, continuity, and modern leadership. For others, it raised unsettling questions about power, precedent, and the very nature of monarchy itself. Because if the crown could now be shared, what else could change? In the hours following the announcement, the country seemed to hold its breath, not in unity but in quiet uncertainty. Early public opinion, according to various interpretations, revealed a nation split not by outrage, but by hesitation. Some voices, particularly among younger audiences, welcomed the shift with cautious optimism. To them, the idea of adaptation felt necessary, even overdue. A monarchy that could evolve, that could respond to modern pressures with flexibility rather than rigidity, was seen as a sign of resilience rather than weakness. Catherine's presence within that framework only strengthened this perspective, her reputation acting as a stabilizing force in a moment that might otherwise have felt too abrupt, too disruptive. But that optimism was far from universal. Among traditionalists, the reaction carried a different tone, one shaped less by excitement and more by concern. Because for those who view the monarchy as a carefully preserved institution, any alteration to its structure is not just a change, but a risk. The idea of shared sovereignty, no matter how carefully explained, introduced questions that could not be easily dismissed. What happens when authority is divided? Where does accountability run?